Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Revenge has finally happened, but how? The second part of a story with a similar plot. Enjoy it! You are listening to the second part of the story. You can listen to the first part in the previous video or by following the link in the description under this video. Happy listening! As my brain reset and I felt more rational, I realized that there was no hint of recognition in Rebecca's eyes, even when she looked in my direction. You expect some kind of reaction from a woman who had just seen her long-lost husband, but there was nothing. She wasn't pretending, she genuinely did not know who I was. This led to the next obvious question: who is this guy she's with now? He was much older, and he had a seriousness about him that made me assume he was someone important. Maybe my waiter knows him. I made a barely noticeable gesture, and he quietly approached the table. Experienced waiters know how to be vigilant. I nodded towards my wife and said, "I think I know this couple, but I can't remember their last name." "You don't know who they are, do you?" The waiter laughed and said, "Of course, senor. This is Dr. and Mrs. March Bretman. She is famous as the mysterious Lady of the Sea, and he is the director of the psychiatric hospital in Palma. They often have lunch here." My God, Becky is married. I took a €100 bill out of my money clip and placed it on the table. The waiter glanced sideways at her and suddenly became a source of information. He said, "Everyone in Palma knows their story. The doctor saved her life and then married her. It's very romantic, isn't it?" "Crap," I said, trying to keep my voice indifferent. "Tell me about this story." The waiter said, "The beautiful lady was saved by a fisherman. She was found floating on a life raft in the open sea. We have no idea how she ended up in this place. She was there with 3 others, but she was the only one left alive. She was taken to a hospital in Menorca. I knew that Menorca was an island northeast of Majorca, directly in the flight path from Andrews in Washington to Sardinia. This is where her plane was supposed to crash," I said with a slight hesitation in my voice. "How badly was she hurt?" "She was wounded, senor, but the main problem was that she had been lying under the hot sun for some time without food or water and was not herself. Therefore, she was transferred to the psychiatric hospital here." "Not herself?" I said in horror. "Gone mad, I guess. Floating in a life raft after a plane crash can do that to you." The waiter laughed and said, "No, sir. She is a very smart and kind lady. I myself have had the pleasure of serving her several times. She just doesn't remember who she is and how she ended up where she was found." "So Becky suffers from amnesia?" I thought it was just a myth or a plot device. It is more pertinent to ask how someone with amnesia cannot be identified in this modern age. Someone somewhere must have a file on her. And then it dawned on me, Becky's security clearance required that anything identifying her be kept national security classified. This information could not be disclosed to anyone, especially if she inexplicably disappeared. So there was no way people in Majorca could have accessed BA's identity. I pushed the €100 bill towards the waiter, saying, "Thank you for the information." He, as if by magic, made it disappear. He nodded demurely and went back to watching the other diners as they ate. As for me, I had been mourning the loss of my wife for 3 years, and suddenly she appeared, sitting no more than 6 meters in front of me. This might piss some people off, but I'm a nerd. No matter how strange we may seem to normal people, in a stressful situation, nerds will always replace emotions with logic. If you need a reminder, remember the guy from Long Life and Riches. I analyzed the facts and accepted that the mysterious Lady of the Sea was indeed my wife, and that she did not remember anything from her life before the disaster. This goes without saying. I also understood why Becky fell in love with her doctor. She is a soulful person and naturally gravitated towards those who helped her. Of course, she was already married to me, but neither she nor her doctor knew about this. To be honest, I also had some questions about the ethics of a doctor marrying his patient, no matter how attractive she may be. But that had nothing to do with the current question, which was what I could do to return things to the way they were before I encountered her. The confounding variable was myself. I was still a nerd. I dressed like one and acted like one, but I was no longer the same person Becky knew. I was infinitely richer, perhaps the richest man on this island. Therefore, I could have done anything, including blowing off her current husband if I wanted. But the one thing I was not going to do was try to seduce her. If she truly had amnesia, then any attempt to come between her and her husband would put me in the same category as Osborne, and I didn't consider myself that way. I've been through pain, and I wouldn't do that to anyone. Thus, any attempts to lure the current Becky away from her second husband were rejected. BA's fall was all shaky, and I always thought she was more of prey than a hunter. This was true whether I decided to stay with her or not, but now it didn't matter. The woman I had already begun to think of as Rebecca 2.0 was a completely different person, and I had to approach the problem that way, even if she was technically still my Becky. I heard light laughter at her table. Becky loved to laugh. She hadn't changed a bit from the wonderful woman I knew and loved. Of course, there was one obvious exception. She lived on the island of Majorca and was married to another man. I had a lot to think about and needed a lot more information before deciding what to do next. I signed the bill, stood up, and left the terrace. On the way, I had to pass by them. She looked at me, and I winked. For a moment, a shadow of confusion passed over her face, like a cloud crossing a prairie on a sunny day. Then she smiled joyfully and said, "Good morning." Becky always reacted this way to strangers passing by. I held myself tightly and continued walking. Opening the door to my room, I found Based on the sunny balcony enjoying her second afternoon nap. Cats. I think statistically, the average 12-year-old cat sleeps for 7 of those years. The room featured a wood-paneled office with an ornate desk. I cheerfully walked over to my laptop and Googled plane crash survivor. This was the first thing I needed to understand. Everything was on the internet. Minorca is even smaller than Majorca, therefore, the story of her rescue was covered only at the local level. However, at the time, it was a sensation. This is where the nickname Mysterious Lady of the Sea came from. They must have left the plane, the waiter said. She was found floating in a life raft. She suffered from dehydration and sunburn and sustained a serious head injury. The coma she fell into may have saved her life because it lowered her metabolism to the point that she was still alive when the men in the fishing boat stumbled upon her. The long-term consequence of all this was retrograde amnesia. This was because she must have received a blow. This is a rare but not uncommon condition and is usually associated with traumatic brain injury, such as in a plane crash. This is like wiping a computer's memory without affecting its ability to process and access data. People suffering from this type of amnesia lose their previous life but do not lose their basic abilities. So even though Becky spoke Spanish to her husband, I was willing to bet that she still spoke English and still had a remarkable IQ. People suffering from retrograde amnesia lose their most recent memories first. This may be permanent, or they may return over time. Therefore, Becky will probably never be able to remember that she was married or even that she graduated from college, but she was able to retain a few memories of her childhood. It's been 3 years now, so her memories of me are no doubt lost forever. I wondered what it would be like to remember that you grew up in the US, but your whole reality is rooted in Majorca, Spain. This couldn't be pleasant. I guess that's what her new husband helped her deal with. I checked him too. Brett Mann was German. This was not strange since it seems that half of this cold nation lives in Majorca. He was a doctor and director of a psychiatric institute on the island. He was considerably older than both of us, 63 to Becky and I's 38, and he had a reputation as a highly respected doctor. I didn't blame him for falling in love with my wife. She is a magnificent creature, but this is the least of what comes from her. Her joy for life, easy spirit, intelligence, and inner strength would be exceptional qualities in any person. They were married for a little over 2 years. I wasn't even going to think about their life together. For more than 10 years, I enjoyed Becca's sweet love, lively communication, and outstanding erotic talents. Brett Mann was now the recipient of her bounty. I just couldn't go there and keep my sanity. I needed to make a decision. I saw that Becky was alive, therefore, the simplest and perhaps most altruistic thing to do would be to sail to another place, let her live the life of a Mallorcan aristocrat, not knowing about my existence, and I could live on knowing that she is happy. So why did it seem so unfortunate? I told myself, What is the problem? You were almost certainly going to divorce her anyway. The problem was that I was still very much in love with her. I understand that this is a contradiction, but the complexity of emotions is that they do not obey the laws of physics. After all, two different feelings can simultaneously exist in the same space. The only thing I knew for sure was that this moment was critical in my life. I must make wise choices or live the rest of my days consumed by regret. Based, who has a cat's ability to read minds, came and easily jumped onto my lap. I stroked her while she looked at me with huge green eyes and seemed to say, "She's yours, brother. You must not allow anyone else to take your spoils." Cats are absolutists, they cut through the fog and get to the core. Forget about what is good or bad. Becky is still my wife, and I can't just sail off into the sunset and leave her in the arms of another guy, not if I want to maintain my manhood. I wasn't going to try to take her away from Bretman if she chose him, but just like that fateful night, I wanted an affirmative answer to the question, "Do you choose me?" Unfortunately, for the sake of my conscience, I will have to do this without violating any of my own rules of righteous behavior. Perhaps I don't exist in B 2.0's world. If this is the case, then the right and honorable thing to do would be to leave her in her new life. However, all descriptions of retrograde amnesia state that victims regain their memories if exposed to the right stimuli. With the exception of one tragic day, Rebecca and I had a perfect love and marriage. So, I thought it would be no big deal if I dangled it in front of her just to see what I could get out. Fortunately, her maternal husband was a March Ordinas. March Ordinas was Francisco Franco's best friend and one of the leading fascist leaders in Spain. He was also the man who founded the dynasty that still controls much of Spanish banking, and the Juan March Museum is a Majorca landmark. Perhaps March created it to buy some respectability, especially after the fall of Hitler and his fellow dictators, but it does contain one of the finest collections of 20th century Spanish art in the world. Be that as it may, my interest in this museum was due to the fact that Becky's husband was a member of its board. There are many branches of this family, and I doubted that the good doctor was a direct heir to the March Ordina's money given his German surname. But the fact that part of his family name is embossed above the door means Bretman must be involved in the fundraiser. The museum sponsors a number of creative endeavors. One of them is dance, and this coming Saturday they plan to hold a fundraiser here with the participation of the touring troupe of the National Ballet of Cuba. There are different categories of donors, and my donation ensures that the good doctor and his wife, the mysterious Lady of the Sea, will be obliged to invite me to this evening. There was still a day left until the event, and to be honest, I didn't want to risk running into Becky. So, I got into the Beamer and drove 45 minutes across the island to the north side. The concierge told me about a place called Alcudia. It is just a few miles east of Pensa, the main town on the northeast coast. Alcudia is an entire preserved Roman city, just like the more famous Pompeii in Italy. On the side of the road stands the forum, houses, and theater as the Romans left them. Most of the buildings have thigh-high walls, just like Pompeii, but walking around this place feels like traveling back in time. I wandered around the city for a while, just touching the ghosts. Then I sat down on a 2,000-year-old stone bench and thought about the true purpose of my trip. I wanted to go as far outside of myself as possible to appreciate what I had planned, and the farthest place I could think of was ancient Rome. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I would have divorced Becky after the Osborne incident. I truly believed that she had made a one-time mistake. She was a smart woman and most likely would not do that again. But the damage done to my psyche, and yet my ego, was likely irreparable. I loved her and still wanted her, but in my mind, the events of that fateful Christmas party were like a cancer slowly eating away at our marriage. So, divorce seemed the only logical step, and I think we both understood that. Of course, when I learned that she had died, all the emotional baggage associated with her actions that fateful night was buried under a tsunami of grief and loss. The terrible news completely washed away all traces of infidelity and replaced them with a feeling of regret. I loved her when she was alive and felt that I should be more merciful and understanding towards her now that she was dead. Then, like the ghost of Christmas past, she appeared again, a completely different person due to her amnesia and married to another man. Oddly enough, it didn't seem strange to me that I met her on this island. I specifically came to the Balearics to visit the place where her plane crashed, and undoubtedly Majorca was the place where they would take someone if they found them alive. Now, I was literally dealing with a new version of my wife. Honestly, I realized that if I made any attempt to wake her up, it would lead to a serious breakdown for both of us. It was a risk because a lot has changed. So, given all this moral turmoil, what's the right thing to do? I just didn't know. Perhaps the best outcome would be that Becky would not regain any of her memories of me. I could start a new life with the confidence that fate had decreed it this way. But what should I do if she does remember me? How do you establish a relationship with a person who is everything to you and at the same time a complete stranger? My main concern was, am I doing the right thing? I knew Bastet's answer. She would say that I should be true to myself and my nature because honor lies in being who you are. If that's the case, then I should at least make an honest attempt to get my wife back. To attend the celebration, I hired a limousine. I could drive my BMW M8, an amazing car, but I wanted to be flexible, considering all the possible outcomes of our meeting. The museum itself is located on a traditional street of Palma that is narrow and elegant. I stepped out of the limousine and through the beautiful wrought iron Spanish gates at the entrance into the cool, bustling world of wealth and power. I was wearing a $7,000 Armani silk tuxedo that the hotel had made for me overnight, and I looked the part. Despite this, I was nervous. I was probably richer than everyone else here combined, but just 3 years ago, I was an army nerd from mid-Michigan, intimidated by the glitz and glamour. A gorgeous young Spanish woman in a tight little black dress stood at the tastefully tailored reception desk. I walked up to her, and she greeted me with a 4,000 megawatt smile. She saw that I was American and probably a donor, so she said, "How can I help you, senor?" I presented my documents. She tapped a little on the keys of the registration laptop, and her eyes widened. She said, embarrassed, "Of course, senor. Let me take you to the owners." Okay, maybe I went a little overboard with the donation, but it was the most important event in my life. I followed the girl through several rooms which obviously contained high-end art. I work in software, so I don't know anything about artists, but from the pretentious conversation, I realized that I was among Moreau's, Picasso's, and Dali's. Oh my God. The owners themselves waited in the area where food was served. When I walked in, I saw my wife as Osborne must have seen her, sensually slender and nicely. She was wearing a red dress, different from the one she was wearing the last time I saw her 3 long years ago. The dress highlighted Becky's stunning looks, raven black hair, sparkling blue eyes, alabaster skin with red lipstick and nails. She had a perfectly proportioned body, hips, waist, and breasts. It was educational, honestly. How can you resist something like that? But this time she looked relaxed, graceful, effortless, and truly sophisticated. This was not the nerdy girl I knew and loved. March Bretman was wearing a tuxedo. He looked disdainfully domineering and, at the same time, exhausted. He was much shorter than me, like most people, with a head full of snow-white hair and an impeccable Van Dyke-style beard. He and Becky were not at all suitable for each other. I saw that they loved each other and were comfortable in their relationship, but in reality, they were more like father and daughter than husband and wife. I was aware of the fact that Becky had turned into a completely different person when she went dark, and I had the funny thought that sooner or later she would probably kill the doctor within him, which of course caused an amazing attack of pure, undisguised jealousy. I realized that I had no right to feel this way because, in all moral and legal senses, the woman I met was Bretman's wife, not mine. My little voice whispered in warning, all this error. My young lady guide approached them as if they were royalty and said something in Spanish. Both turned and looked inquisitively in my direction. They must have known about the shocking amount of money I had just added to the museum's operating budget. Only Becky separated and headed towards me, accompanied by the little hostess of the evening, leaving her husband standing alone. She smiled welcomingly, and I almost fainted from the unreality of it all. It's one thing to plan, but as Quit said, no plan survives its first encounter with the enemy. Becky approached me serenely with the grace and radiant confidence of a lady from the estate. She extended her hand in a noble greeting. I took hers into mine, and the whole universe changed. Humans are electrical creatures. Our nerves transmit signals from cell to cell, which in concept is no different from a network. And we just completed the circuit. I felt a connection. She did too. Becky's face changed from calm to puzzled. She said in a strong Spanish accent, "Welcome, I'm Maria March Bretman. My husband doesn't speak English fluently, so he asked me to greet you." Confusion was written on her face. I thought in shock, "Maria?" Then it dawned on me, that's right, she doesn't remember who she is, so of course, she was given a new name. In a Catholic country, what could be more fitting for the mysterious Lady of the Sea than Mary? I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "Happy to be here, madam." I demonstrated this happiness by depositing 50 grand into their treasurer. Perhaps I could have gotten an invitation for less money, but I didn't want anyone to interrupt me. Additionally, this is just the accrued interest for a single day. Money makes money, and I couldn't spend it all in a dozen lifetimes. I added, "My name is Eric, and I'm honored to meet two such outstanding philanthropists." When I said my name, Maria began to look even more confused and upset. However, she recovered gracefully and said, "Let me introduce you to my husband. He is a sponsor of this event and would like to thank you for your donation. I will translate for him." I could barely stand because, in fact, I was her husband, and everything was starting to seem like a very bad idea. She turned, and I followed her. Oh my God, the dress was backless right down to her two adorable dimples. Becky would never wear something like that. The smooth, muscular alabaster vision before me nearly gave me a heart attack. It's a miracle that my hand didn't shake when I shook Bretman's hand. He said something in Spanish, and Maria translated, "My husband thanks you for your donation and would like to know who you are and what you do." The guy was just being polite, however, he took me through the looking glass much earlier than I had planned. Well, I thought. I took up the tug and said, speaking slowly so that Maria could translate, "I worked for the U.S. government in a place called Fort Meade in Maryland." Maria gave me a shocked look and then looked away with growing concern. Fort Meade definitely brought back memories, of course. She spent her entire professional life there. I added, "I was happily married to a woman named Rebecca, whom I loved immensely, but she died in a plane crash, and her death almost killed me too. It was already close to the line, but if I wanted to resurrect old memories, I had to tell it like it was." Maria translated again, looking more and more puzzled. Her husband listened politely, the way you would if some boring nerd who had just handed you $50,000 in cash was telling his life story. I added, moving into territory that Becky knew nothing about, "I was so devastated by her loss that I resigned from the army and went public with my little invention. It brought in an incredible amount of money." Then I laughed and said smugly, "Well, you know how technology creates billionaires overnight." Bretman couldn't have known this because even Americans don't understand the implausible world of tech markets. So I added, "And since then, I've been wandering around the world trying to come to terms with the loss of my wife, whom I called Becky." I finished sadly, "It is very difficult." At this point, I stopped and looked at Maria for her to translate, but she stood silently with a worried expression on her face. Then she stammered, "Sorry," and ran away in the direction of the registration desk. A few minutes later, that little Spanish beauty appeared and said, "Mrs. March Bretman is not feeling well, so she asked me to translate for you." She was puzzled by Maria's rapid departure, as was the good doctor. I wasn't. I asked Bretman, "Will everything be okay with your wife?" I actually wasn't interested in Maria's health. I wanted to know the diagnosis. The girl translated my question. Bretman said something in response to her for a long time and then turned and left. It was clear that he was embarrassed to deal with me without having his wife as a buffer, and so they got rid of me. I didn't object because I now considered it an unimportant detail. The Spanish woman beckoned to me and then turned and walked towards the luxurious bar. I followed her, admiring the sway of her beautiful round hips. She was about 5 feet 7 inches and perfectly proportioned if you like curvy women. Imagine a 23-year-old version of Salma Hayek. She said something to the people behind the counter, and they immediately brought out an elegant jug of cool sangria. This was exactly the drink suitable for this occasion. She took 2 large, round glasses of fruit and walked to the table. The place began to fill with guests, and I noticed Bretman at the other end of the hall entertaining, as it seemed to me, a whole flock of grandas. This was Becky's world now. I saw that I did not belong to it. I sat down at the table while the girl poured us a couple of rather large glasses of wine and said, "My name is Sophia, and Dr. Bretman has asked me to be your hostess for the rest of the evening." The dark, luminous eyes on her gorgeous face suggested that there was more to this statement than a simple desire to be hospitable. "Did he tell you what happened to Mrs. March Bretman? It looks like the problem is much more serious than a simple headache or upset stomach." Sophia replied, "You must have heard that Dr. Bretman's wife is in a very strange situation." I said rather impatiently, "Yes, she was found adrift at sea with no memory of her past. Dr. Bretman is the man who treated her, and they eventually became lovers and got married." I heard this story almost as soon as I landed here. She added with doubt in her voice, "Dr. Bretman just explained that recently his wife has begun to recover parts of her past. 3 years is the typical point in the development of amnesia when the patient begins to remember what they have lost. When this happens, it can be very upsetting for the patient." I nodded in agreement and said, "I understand. The patient should feel as if she is waking up from a dream, where it is difficult to tell exactly where the dream ends and reality begins." Sophia added, "Apparently, you said something that made Mrs. Bretman remember part of her past, which is why she left so abruptly. The doctor thinks it's probably because you're an American, and she was from that country." I thought, or maybe it's because I basically just trampled on Rebecca Spencer's grave by telling Maria March Bretman who she really is. Sophia continued, "So, the doctor asked me to ask you to please leave. He means no disrespect and is grateful for your donation, but he loves his wife, and it's obvious that your presence here upsets her." Seriously, Rebecca, or Becky, or Maria, or whatever her name was no more upset than I was. I planned to throw a few breadcrumbs to see if I couldn't get her back to her old life, but now that I had let the genie out of the bottle, I had the overwhelming feeling that I had gone too far. Worse, as far-fetched as it may sound, I also wondered if the good doctor had gotten the hint that I was more than I seemed. Here is the corrected version of the sentence. It was clear to any observer that he was not an idiot and that my presence had a radical emotional effect on his wife. Sophia continued in her sultry voice, "He asked me to accompany you if you want, and he will pay for whatever the two of us do tonight, yeah, bribe. What's wrong with me taking this stunning young girl to my home for a sweaty night of passion? She was probably the prettiest 23-year-old on the island. And I was certain that judging by the ample cleavage on display in her little short black dress, she would be amazing in bed." She looked at me with hunger and anticipation, waiting for the obvious answer. The only problem was that I still have a wife, and I just don't think it's right, no matter how crazy it sounds. As I've said before, nerds made for life, and I didn't want to complicate an already difficult situation further. I said, hating myself for sounding like a sentimental fool, "You are an incredibly attractive girl, Sophia, but I've already caused enough trouble this evening, so now I'll just go back to the hotel alone." Her face fell. "I'm a good guy, and with my money, Quasimodo would look attractive," I added with regret in my voice. "I probably shouldn't have come here in the first place. Tell the doctor I'm sorry I upset his wife, and no hard feelings." I stood up, and Sophia walked me back to the courtyard exit. I kicked myself as I stood there in the soft palmonite. She was a beautiful and sensual young woman, but I needed to get away from there to think. "Nerds think too much, this is our curse," I sincerely said. "I'll feel better in the morning. Give me your number, maybe I'll call you." This cheered her up. I handed her my phone, and she entered the number into it, saying with a lot of promises in her voice, "Call me, senor, you will not regret it," and I went outside. I probably looked out of place walking around in a silk tuxedo amid the hustle and bustle of Cara. It was lunchtime, so the streets were crowded with the noise and smell of those ubiquitous little motorized scooters that locals ride like they want to kill themselves, and you. They moved through the leisurely herd of tourists like border collies herding sheep. I walked slowly in the beauty of the evening palm, dealing with strong conflicting emotions. I couldn't go back to what it was like after meeting Becky and talking to her, but what could I do in this situation? The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to do something. The large crowd was excited as they passed through the arch leading to the Plaza Mayor. Plaza Mayor is the central place in this part of Mallorca. This is a huge space where open-air markets are held. That evening, there was some kind of spectacular fireworks show. Everyone stopped to watch. I stood a few meters from the plaza with my hands in my pockets and looked up as rockets streaked overhead and burst into starlight, which provided the perfect backdrop for a quiet voice behind me to say, "Hello, Eric." I knew this could happen, but it still shook me to the core. She followed me. I turned around, and she was standing there in her gorgeous red dress with tears in her eyes, looking both scared and hopeful. Her stunning beauty was like a physical blow to the chest. This set me back a step. I said in a trembling voice, "Rebecca." She nodded readily. It was the same quick nod she gave when I first learned she was Tiffany Arian. Then she ran into my arms, and we kissed like long-lost lovers, which we probably were. The crowd around us thought I proposed or something. Everyone was clapping and cheering us on, and we kept clinging to each other as if we ever let each other go, we'd bring the whole world down. You could almost hear the romantic music playing in the background. At that moment, the romantic interlude was interrupted by 5 men in formal uniforms. A gloomy elderly man, clearly their leader, approached us and said authoritatively, "Come with me, Madam Bretman, and we will take you back to your husband." The tone of voice sounded like someone talking to a mentally ill person. She looked at him and said firmly, "My last name is not Bretman, and I am not a doctor's wife." She turned, pointed at me, and said, "I am his wife." This small gesture meant the world to me. Rebecca made her choice without hesitation. The leader said patronizingly, "Of course, madam, but we still have to return you to your husband. He is very worried about you." It suddenly dawned on me that the entire conversation was conducted in English. It was for my sake. He turned to his 2 henchmen and said, "Please escort Mrs. Bretman back to the museum." Each man carefully took one of Becca's hands and led her away. She continued to protest gently. This was the Becky I knew. She would rather die than arrange a scandal. The gentleman doing all the talking turned to me and said, "I have instructions to put you on a boat and see to it that you leave this harbor. If you do not do this, you will be arrested for attempting to kidnap Mrs. Bretman." I realized that Bretman was not as ignorant as I thought. He guessed that I was Baker's real husband and wanted me to disappear. Then he could return to the pleasant pastime of psychologically manipulating my wife. The clumsy attempt to sweep me under the rug completely negated any moral obligations I might have towards our common spouse. The authorities are on his side, and there was no way I could win in the current situation. But as I mentioned, I have certain skills, and Bretman just bought himself a one-way ticket to his doom. It's time to play dirty. My boat was in the same direction as the hotel. However, instead of taking Cara del Sapador to Placa de la Reina, we took Avinguda de Antoni Mora, which led directly to the marina. I was passive throughout the entire walk because they essentially threw me back into the thorn bush. I needed to get to my hacking gear before I could do some really bad things to each and every bad guy, and that was on a yacht, but my luggage and Batet were still in the hotel. I protested, "You should let me go back to the hotel to get my clothes and the cat." The man said with light sarcasm, "This has already been taken care of, sir. My people don't appreciate your cat, unless it really is a cat and not a miniature leopard. 2 of them are now with the doctors. They are treating their wounds." Obviously, Batet did not go easy. He added warningly, "If you return, you will be arrested on serious charges." When his men dropped me off, I, without saying a word, climbed into the closed central cabin of the Hallis and started the inner diesel. I switched on the engine and slowly sailed out of the parking lot, turned on the running lights, and headed southwest towards the distant lighthouse of Cap de Cala Figuera and apparently out of their lives. As soon as I cleared the breakwater and entered the Bay of Palma, I turned off my running lights and silently sailed towards Isla de la Rada near the Pla de Belver area southeast of Palma. The entire time I was doing this, Batet was complaining loudly from below deck. As soon as I was firmly on the 2 anchors, I opened the gangway hatch, and she rushed past me as if she wanted to continue the fight. I lofted and said, "They're all gone." Batet stared at me with the primal rage of her kind blazing in her huge green eyes and said indignantly, "They put me in a cage. It's good that you killed them all, brother. It saved me a lot of hassle. Cats never stray far from the jungle, after all." The emotional turmoil of the evening, it was still only 10:30. I poured myself a couple of glasses of Johnny Walker Blue to relax, lit a Cohiba Cuban cigar, and sat on the deck with my cat. Batet was still fantasizing about ripping out her guts. I watched the lights come on in the hotels behind Pla de Belver. I had a long night ahead of me and wanted to take the time to think of the perfect plan. It was obvious that my wife had regained her memory, and I needed to get her to the yacht and away from this place before her current husband had a chance to reprogram her. I began to suspect that her memory was beginning to return in the usual way, but the person she trusted most, her doctor and husband, kept her on a short mental leash. I was going to rip off this leash and make everyone pay for it. I had on board a system unit with a 32-core AMD Ryzen Threadripper 3970X processor. Its computing power would be enough to make a black hole jealous. So, speed and time were not important concepts to me. I also had a 100 megabit connection, allowing me to work from anywhere in the world, including Palma Bay. In the real world, I may be a tall, skinny nerd, but in the virtual world, I'm a blonde paladin. The time has come to save the beautiful maiden. Bretman and his friends won't even know what hit them. Palma authorities awoke to a flashing warning that read critical weather warning. The link was an official Spanish government URL. Most people clicked on it, which resulted in a 4004 error message. This was such a common occurrence that no one thought about it until all their systems were externally managed. Bretman received several types of messages, including invitations to watch TikTok videos on various interests of his, offers to sell a number of expensive items he liked, and an ominous request from his bank marked private and confidential. He bought the latter. Now I own this man's entire life. Hackers rely on people to click on links. Meanwhile, I spent most of the night driving around Palma on the other side of the island. With a little light internet research, I found the Bretman mansion. This was the place where Becky was treated for her delusions about having another husband, not far from Cara de Formentor, about 200 meters from where I moored my Zodiac. I was dressed like an ordinary tourist, relaxing quite innocently with my cat and backpack leaning against the high cement wall of the Bretman complex. To complete my plans, I needed to be closer to home. I knew Becky was there, but I had no idea where exactly she was or how many people were looking after her. A Wi-Fi pineapple is a popular penetration testing gadget because it is the evil twin that allows network theft. However, it has a limited range. Therefore, I had to be in close proximity to the router. Such closeness can be created using a network repeater, and I just happened to have one that fit perfectly on the cat's collar. Batet is not the most accommodating animal, but if she thinks it's about hunting, she can be persuaded to do anything. Batet hissed as I threw her over the wall. "When should I bring the loot, brother?" I said, "Just scout out this place for us and come back as soon as you can." It took no more than a minute for the repeater on Bastet's collar to ping Bretman's router and establish communication with my pineapple. I pressed the button, dropping the repeater from the collar into the grass. I didn't want Batet to take it out of range. Then I used my iPad to change the pineapple's SSID to the SSID of the router in my house. Now the evil twin was running the show, and I had access to all the digital equipment in Bretman's house. I waited a couple of minutes, and Batet flew over the wall again. Naturally, something was twitching in her mouth. I said impatiently, "Drop it." She growled, "Wait," and disappeared into the bushes. A minute later, she came out looking pleased and followed me around the perimeter of the complex until we reached the gate, controlled by the system I had just taken over. I was sure that Becky was in the house. Her phone was pinging all night, and the small dot was blinking regularly in the same place. However, I needed to know exactly where she was. The security cameras in the house were state-of-the-art. Becky was reading in her luxurious bedroom. She was wearing skinny jeans and a simple peasant blouse that emphasized the perfect oval of her face. She looked like she was being sedated. There were several servants in the house, all women, and one thug guard sipping coffee in the kitchen. I needed to distract the guard. I'm a pretty big guy myself and quite strong, but nerds aren't instinctive fighters. They prefer tricks. With the guard out of the way, I planned to run about 100 meters to the French doors that opened from Becca's bedroom into the expansive ornamental garden. From there, I had to return to the Zodiac and head out into the Mediterranean Sea. I programmed an attack on the function buttons. The first was to set off the alarm in the garage behind the mansion, several hundred meters up the hill. As soon as the guard responded to the alarm, the second would unlock the gate, and the third would unlock Beck's room. I saw from the system that all of its doors were protected by digital locks. Bretman literally kept his wife under lock and key. This meant that Becky had told him that she was my wife, and in my mind, this dishonorable act of his justified everything I was about to do. Even if I didn't know that the good doctor was sleeping with my hot girlfriend Sophia on the side, the moment of truth had come. I told Batet, "Stay here," and pressed button number 1. In the distance, a siren howled ominously. I saw the guard jump to his feet and run out the door, followed by most of the staff. Then, I pressed buttons 2 and 3. The gates unlocked and began to swing open. I rushed across the lawn. Batet was running silently next to me, her impatient look saying, "Who are we attacking, brother?" I walked up to the French doors to Becky's room. My wife heard the warning siren and stood in the doorway, looking outside worriedly. As soon as she noticed me, an expression of adoration appeared on her beautiful face, and I hesitated, shocked by the depth of my feelings for her. Batet hissed, "Faster, brother." I reached out, turned the handle, and opened the door. Becky looked surprised. She obviously knew she was imprisoned and wondered why the door opened so easily. I grabbed her hand and said, "Hurry up," and we began to walk back down the sloping lawn to the gate. As soon as we were outside the walls, Becky said, "Wait." She turned and did something intricate with the gate keypad. The gate slowly closed. I didn't know what spell she was using, but my wife is a real magician. She said, "I blocked them. It will take forever to get out of the complex." Anyone watching from the outside would have seen the tall beast and his beautiful wife casually strolling hand in hand towards the water. Oddly enough, they were accompanied by a large gray-spotted cat walking next to them like a house dog. The three of them climbed into the Zodiac and sailed away to a big blue sailboat and a new life together. The authorities of Palma agreed to forget about the existence of Becky and me, that is, if I unlocked their computers. It's amazing how governments around the world have become so dependent on their information systems and how much leverage can be gained by accidentally owning them. Isn't ransom fun? As for Bretman, I could prove that he was a randy old goat. I had messages and emails documenting his inappropriate affair with his assistant, Sophia Montes. And in the case of my wife, it turned out that the good doctor kept Becky in strict psychotropic bonds the entire time they were married. In my opinion, this was exactly the same as criminal rape. I had enough information on this man from the data dump I scraped from his computer to ruin his life. And I sent him an anonymous message through the Tor browser to make him aware of this fact. Yet, it turned out that the loss of his wife was punishment enough. Becky was the only thing he truly treasured. However, since I felt the same way about her, I was in no mood to share. Becky fell asleep as soon as we got on board. The Hylas had an exceptionally luxurious cabin with a real bunk, and she staggered across the deck and down the companionway. As she disappeared, she muttered, "He gave me something. I don't know what it is, but I need to sleep." I added one more charge to Bretman's account. I said with the relief one might feel when one has just gotten one's life back, "Stay there as long as necessary. We have a lot of conversations to do, and you need to be rested and clear-headed to do it." Much more could be said, but that will be later when the nightmare passes. I knew we needed space and time to deal with the radical changes in our lives. There were several places we could go, but there were also limitations. The first was that we could not go to the nearest shore, Spain. I had enough problems in this country, so it would be France. I may have been richer than Cuz, but the situation was relatively new to me, and my previous experience had not extended beyond Michigan, Pittsburgh, Fort Benning, and the Beltway. So I did what any ignorant botanist would do. I went to the only place I had ever heard of and which I knew for sure was in the south of France, Monaco. The satellite navigation showed that it was just over 400 miles away and about 2 days' journey. I set the autopilot to magnetic heading 047 north-northeast and raised the sails to a steady 8 knots. A strong westerly wind was still blowing, and we were on starboard tack. It was a beautiful day for swimming. The Hylas is a wet boat in the sense that it is designed to cut through the waves rather than crash against them. This design provides a smoother ride, but at the same time, a lot of water gets through the side. Therefore, the cockpit located immediately behind the mast is sealed. I was sitting at the helm admiring the late evening sunset when my wife appeared with Batet. Becky left her previous life with nothing but clothes on her, but she got hold of one of my hoodies. Since there's almost a 30 centimeters difference between her height and mine, she maintained her modesty. Batet curled around Becky's legs as cats do, expressing love, which was surprising since I did not even suspect that Batet loved anyone other than herself. Becky drank 2 glasses of the premium bourbon that I keep below deck as ballast. This is my version, and I stand by it. She looked sleepy, handed me 1 bottle, and said, I slept for 13 hours, and I'm going to continue, but I would like to sit here for a minute to reassure myself that it is really you and that everything is really happening. She sat down on the bench next to the pilot's seat, tucked her long slender legs under her, and sipped her wine, looking at me as if she still thought I was a dream. Batet sat next to her like a kind little cat and poked her head, which is what cats do when they mark with a smell what they consider theirs. What did my magician wife do to my formerly ferocious cat? Becky's thick raven hair was tousled, and her huge blue eyes sparkled with sleep. She looked magnificent in the soft fading light of the Mediterranean sunset, her perfectly proportioned features with incredibly sensual lips and long graceful neck sticking out of my old army sweatshirt looked relaxed. She said, It's true, isn't it? Do you still love me? This was not as unusual as it might seem. Seriously, I was considering divorcing her when her plane crashed, and she has been living with Dr. Kobal as husband and wife for the last few years. This can be a deciding factor on several levels if you're a fairly insecure brat. But I just didn't feel it, and I said, Of course, I love you, and I've never stopped loving you no matter the situation. However, the circumstances that will unfold next are complex, and we need to take as much time as necessary to understand them, I added without mincing words. I'm heading to Monaco. Here I stopped to admit my confusion. This is the only place in the south of France that I have ever heard of. We can renew our marriage by going there. Now, go back to bed, and Batet and I will take care of the boat. Becky stood up, and Batet lightly jumped down to the deck and followed her. I muttered under my breath, Traitor. My wife had always been like St. Francis of Assisi when it came to animals, and this was further proof of how little she had changed. When sailing alone, you learn to doze wisely. The course is monitored by an autopilot, but it would be foolish to leave the helm unattended because there are many shipping lanes here. I saw several container ships and other large vessels at various times of the day, but the ocean is huge, and they were just distant points of light. A truly touching sight was the incredible canvas of the black velvet sky with billions of brightly shining diamonds scattered across it. This vision calmed me, as always. If you spend any time in the Mediterranean, you will understand why most Western religions originated in this region. Soon after sunrise, the coast of Francia appeared. We were far out to sea, but on the distant horizon, we could already feel land, and seabirds circled above us, greeting us. Becky looked much more cheerful and had a large mug of black coffee. This time she was wearing only my fisherman's sweater, with her gorgeous legs sticking out from underneath. It made her look like a model from an erotic Ralph Lauren ad. I had been awake for almost 48 hours, with little sleep in between, and I began to hallucinate. So I said, Stay clear of the keels of all passing cruise ships while I grab 3 hours. Becky nodded and took the helm, her new shadow laying adoringly at her feet. I wasn't worried about leaving Becky in charge. She was a better helmsman than I was. When we sailed on the island packet, was it really just 3 eternal years ago? We have something to discuss, I continued. Port Hercules has been a deep-water harbor for ships sailing along the Côte d'Azur since the time of the Phoenicians. It was they who founded the Monaco colony. The Phoenicians came from the Greek part of the Mediterranean, and their hero was Hercules, hence the name of the port. Of course, I didn't know any of this, since I'm a programmer, not a historian. But from where we moored at the Jetée Louisiana, I could see the nearby Monte Carlo casino. The casino was the reason I knew we were in Monaco. Maybe later I can watch James Bond play baccarat with Le Chiffre in Casino Royale, I thought. The yacht Hylas, only 132 meters long and worth $1 million, was squeezed into the breakwater's outer dock, along with the rest of the rabble in this ancient port. Only the super yachts of the oligarchs received good berths. Becky let me sleep for a full 5 hours before she woke me up. Now, we sat side by side on the velvet benches at the stern, drinking delicious Kona roast coffee and looking in amazement at the city waking up around us. My beautiful wife led 2 separate, very private lives, first as a happy nerd from the Beltway, and then as a cloistered aristocrat on a small island. and therefore, she was no more sophisticated than I was. She was dressed in jeans and a peasant blouse, which she had worn when we fled Mallorca. So the first thing was to dress her as befits the wife of a fabulously rich eccentric. All the luxury shops in Monaco are concentrated around Place du Casino, located a 15-minute walk from the marina. So we walked hand in hand to the Golden Circle. Balenciaga, Prada, Gucci, Saint Laurent, and Dior were there, but Becky headed straight to Zara, a Spanish and relatively inexpensive store. Apparently, 3 years spent as a Spanish flu took their toll. $28,000 later, our things were delivered, and we stopped for lunch at La Grille on the 8th floor of the Hotel de Paris. From here, we had a panoramic view of the city below us, vibrant and sunlit. It was an inspiration, especially to a couple of unsophisticated nerds from Sodom and Gomorrah on the Potomac. Of course, this elephant still stood between us, and sooner or later, we would have to fight it. Up to this point, we were just trying to survive, and survival seems to narrow your horizons to really important things. Now that we're back in that comfortable rut that all married people fall into, it's time to open a can of worms, I thought. The first difference I noticed about Becky 2.0 was that she was no longer shy. This version was wearing one of her new acquisitions, old items that had been thrown into the trash bin at Zara. It was a simple long-sleeve red top over a tight black outfit that showed off her gorgeous hips, butt, and legs like they were painted on. Guys all over the restaurant were secretly craning their necks. We sat in the bright sun, poking around our soufflé, waiting for another to open the auction. Finally, Becky said puzzled, "How did you become so rich?" The question was reasonable, since the last time she saw me, I was living on the captain's salary. I answered, trying to speak to the point, "Do you remember that gadget I worked on all those Saturdays? So at your funeral, I got to talking with your father. That was probably the stupidest thing I could ever say." I managed to roll both my own and her parents' deep grief into a monumental ball of guilt. She recoiled as if I had slapped her and then sat for a minute, looking out the window. Finally, she turned to me and said, with tears in her eyes, "It must have been terrible for you. There are times in life when you need to think carefully about what you're going to say." She probably expected to be offended. After all, we both knew what prompted it. But her death put everything in its place, and her subsequent life as a different person erased any feeling that the woman sitting at the table opposite me was the old Becky. I needed to tread carefully. It was someone else, and I grew up a little. Greed worried and said, "I recovered most of my memories, but the details of the period leading up to my awakening in the hospital in Palma are hazy." Hesitantly, she added, "It's like a scene in a movie when you see enough fragments of a cataclysm to understand that you were there, but you don't remember a single detail. I clearly remember how I came to my senses in a crashed plane and moved from its wing to the raft. It was in the dark and in the pouring rain," she added bitterly. "But I don't know how I got there. I remember the sun, the thirst, the pain in my head, and how scared I was. I also remember the panic I felt when I first realized that I didn't remember who I was, but that's all." I said incredulously, "Are you saying that you don't know why you ended up in Mallorca in the first place?" She said, still looking worried, "Yes, can't you tell me?" And I told her. I did this impartially and without editing. Now I was an incredibly rich boor, and she was the ex-wife of a Spanish nobleman, so in my opinion, it would be infantile to waste time on a one-time grievance related to someone else. I told her that we would most likely break up because of this, but now it doesn't matter anymore because we have become two different people. No matter how incredible it may seem, of course, she cried. It was such a sad situation. I assured her that I had extracted several painful pounds of flesh from her seducer, and she said that was not why she was crying. I hear you asking me, why was Becky so dismissive of her blunder with Osborne? Well, think about it. She just spent 3 years doing her duty as a woman with another man, and rightly so. This will most likely be a bigger problem than one drunken slip-up, she said. I am humiliated by what I did that night. I will have to bear this stain for the rest of my life, and I will bear it with shame. I was a naive fool trying to deny my own intimately. But now I know myself much better, and I also know that this will never happen again, she said, looking at me intently. Then, with a challenge in her voice, she continued, "It seems to me that everything I did that night pales in comparison to the fact that I lived with a man whom I loved so much that I married him. Heinrich was very demanding and more than a little perverted, and to make matters worse, I was enjoying it. My wife was completely honest, which is what an honest person should be. At this stage, she said that the old Becky, the nerdy girl I knew and loved, was a thing of the past. Before me is a completely different woman with a refined appetite for the carnal arts, thanks to a very dirty old man. I had a sad feeling that now it was I who was inexperienced. My wife was no longer ashamed of her passions. On the contrary, she used them to the maximum. She and her second husband were obviously doing something extraordinary, and she now appreciated the act of love like a connoisseur. It was something I either had to accept or just leave. I won't lie, this shocked me. I already realized that the stumbling block would be B's second marriage with all the ensuing consequences, and I knew that this was the only thing I would have to come to terms with, that is, if we ever want to return to the intimate connection we once had. But that's my problem. Becky played no role in the decision-making process. However, no matter how insanely jealous I felt at the thought of my beautiful Becky giving herself to this lecherous old goat, I did not at all consider her actions to be infidelity in any sense of the word. Seriously, it would be completely childish to consider her actions as betrayal because she didn't even know about my existence. Even so, I am not Iron Man, so I said with obvious irritation, "Could you be a little more specific with your words?" She frowned and said quietly, "You must understand that I woke up in conditions where I did not know who I was, why I was here, or even where here was." I was terrified. Then, over the course of several months, Heinrich healed me and helped me adjust to the emptiness that was inside me. Naturally, I began to consider him my support and savior. I asked hesitantly, "So you love him?" She understood what I was asking and reacted angrily, "God, no. What I felt for him is a drop in the ocean compared to what I feel and have always felt for you. I didn't know about your existence when I fell in love with Henry and married him. But still, for you to understand how much I have changed, you must admit that I spent 3 years as the wife of another man just like that, right out in the open." I truly appreciated Becky's honesty because it gave us a basis to move forward. I knew that the core of the problem was her marriage, and I was already wondering in the dark of the night as we sailed here how I would react when she said it out loud. Now it's time to face the facts. Our reunion wasn't like running into an ex at the supermarket. Becky left my life in the worst possible way, betrayal. Then she entered her again as another man's mistress. There was no way to untangle this knot, it was too fraught with painful complications. So the obvious answer was to cut it down. Two people who were once soulmates must build brand new memories from that day on, as if they had just met. This was the only solution that would take into account all the outrageous circumstances. For 3 years, I believed Becky was dead, and all that time, she didn't even know I existed. During this time, a completely implausible series of events made me fabulously rich, with all the ensuing changes in worldview and lifestyle. And Becky was now a sophisticated woman with clearly defined and very refined erotic tastes. So, in truth, we were indeed complete strangers who, by coincidence, shared an inherited set of magical feelings. None of us were as innocent as before, but we had endless days ahead of us to establish a new normal. Maybe we could develop this. This may be easy, or it may not be possible. Everything depends on our ability to start over, based only on the individuals we have become. Becky was very smart, so I knew she would understand what I was talking about when I looked deep into her beautiful eyes, extended my hand, and said, "I would like to introduce myself. My name is Eric. We are complete strangers now, but I think that we can build a life together. All we need is to base it on an old love. Do you want to accompany me on this journey?" She gave me the same quick affirmative nod she gave me when we first met, both times before, and simply said, "Forever." My wife was an absolute terror that night, wilder than I remembered her. This was truly our first night alone, at least when we weren't evading the Moroccan authorities or on the ocean, so I wanted to make it unforgettable. I made a reservation at La Montgolfier, Henry J.'s restaurant. It was the closest Michelin-starred restaurant money can buy. Because of her flamboyance, Becky has always favored bright colors, at least in this respect, she has not changed. So she was wearing a sparkly emerald Balenciaga dress that we picked out that morning. It showed off the cleavage of her graceful breasts and her gorgeous slender figure. Looking across the table at Becky, I felt a deep discrepancy between the graceful and sophisticated woman I was dining with and my favorite nerd. My new wife was a striking socialite who fit seamlessly into the luxurious surroundings. I'm much smaller, but I studied the waiters. Being French made a lot of fuss during our meal. But Becky did not take her ardent gaze off me. She seemed to still be convincing herself that she wasn't dreaming. During dinner, we talked about our future, and I felt the past retreating to where it rightfully belongs. We took a taxi back to the pier, wrapped in a cocoon of cozy intimacy. And then, my wife did an amazing thing. She just took a stylish step off the dock onto the deck of the Gilas, wearing 10 centimeters heeled Manolo Blahniks. It's hard to make that transition from moccasins. What's even more incredible is that I've never seen her wear anything other than 5 centimeters heels before. As soon as she stepped onto the deck, she gave me a cat-like smile, unbuttoned her dress, and threw it at her feet, right there in front of God and everyone in the harbor. I knew it was close to midnight, but still, she stood in the Venus Deo pose, wearing nothing but hot black lingerie and taupe elastic stockings. She stood in this position for a second, then she gave me a satisfied look, got out of her dress lying in a heap, came up, grabbed me by the vulgari tie, and dragged me along the ramp. Watching those beautiful tight buns twitch in the thong while I followed was very intense, if you catch my drift. Of course, the fact that Becky was wearing a thong was another reminder that the new version had a few extra features. As soon as we got downstairs, she turned aggressively and knelt down, still giving me a sly smile. She pulled my pants off and got to work. Becky 1.0 has never done anything like this in our entire marriage. This new incarnation of my wife, under the guidance of the good doctor, has clearly learned a lot of new things. Predictably, I was overcome by an explosion of pure jealousy, but I could also tell that this version of B was trying to tell me something with this. She was a new and improved model, and I better just sit back and enjoy the ride. When we got to the bed, Becky wrapped both arms around my neck, placed her right hand behind my head, and pulled me into a heated kiss. Her wide, sensual mouth opened under mine, and I felt her tongue penetrate inside. She make a sound loudly from these sensations. I wrapped my arms around her and pressed her to my chest. Her beautiful chest were between us. She was breathing quickly, overwhelmed by the sensations. Her sounds became louder. She freed herself for a moment, unclasped her bra, and let it slide sensuously from her shoulders. It was a show designed to stimulate me. The old Becky would never have done this. Becca's breasts are truly magnificent. I've seen them thousands of times before, but this is like watching the sun rise over the ocean, proof that God exists. She pushed me away and climbed onto the bed, positioning herself on top of me, and we had intimate. When we finished, I looked into those amazing blue eyes. I saw incredible strength, vitality, and irreplaceable wisdom, and then some. It was a simple statement that there was only room in her heart for one special man, and that man was me. It was a vision of her unwavering loyalty and absolute devotion. The lessons we learned in the process of rebirth have made us devoted life partners, and this newfound wisdom will guide our decisions. Chemistry is a funny thing, the attraction never goes away. Life has taught us both the price of choice. Some people just know it, others have to learn things the hard way. But we both knew the rules now, and they were together forever, she said with deep feeling. I love you, Eric. You will never have a reason to doubt me. It's a cliché that life is a journey of discovery, but again, platitudes exist precisely because they are true. It was the same with us. It took several bad decisions and unimaginable tragedy for us to understand each other. Now, it will be a partnership, hers and mine. We will live our lives to the fullest, and Eric and Becky will fight together against the hellish minions of the Burning Legion forever. Monterosso al Mare is the largest of the 5 ports, the 5 Pearls, 5 fishing villages on the Italian coast located 60 miles south of Genoa. Like the other 4 picturesque towns, it is isolated by steep hills where olives, grapes, and lemon trees have been grown since Roman times. This is an ideal place for people who want to get away from it all, to sit and talk. We sailed leisurely along the Mediterranean coast from France to Italy, stopping at every interesting place we came across. We dropped anchor and took the Zodiac to experience the history, food, and culture, often accompanied by a big spotted cat. Becky and Batet became close, to such an extent that this treacherous cat never left her side. Cats, unlike my wife Rebecca, cats have absolutely no sense of loyalty. However, in many ways, my nightly talks with Batet made me tougher and more pragmatic. At the same time, Becky and I developed a relationship that was perfect for a sailboat. There was no one else, it was just us and the ocean. It had been almost 6 months since we began our journey, and what we found was ourselves, or at least new and improved versions of us. I guess you could call it growing up. We sat at a table outside the Enoteca dell'Aliso restaurant in the old town of Monterosso, enjoying a superb example of local grapes. Becky's fabulous legs and Ralph Lauren mulberry silk shorts threatened to cause a civil uprising among the Italian guys who walked by in packs. Becky loved the attention. She's come a long way from the shy crypto nerd she was just 3.5 years ago. Her bright and sunny personality remained the same, and her almost unearthly intelligence was the same as always. But like the fine wine we enjoyed, my wife achieved an exquisite balance of complexity, power, and elegance from a legendary vintage. She knew how to enjoy life. She continued to give me playful glances as she slowly spread and then crossed her legs again, knowing what this does to the male population. Old Becky would be embarrassed, the new one considered it a kind of sport. She read my expression and said, "Do not look at me like that. You've changed just as much as I have." I laughed out loud. "Of course," I said. "She's right. People may say that money can't buy happiness. This may or may not be true, but money certainly makes time flow pleasantly and calmly," I said based on facts. "Well, the woman you have become is much less conflicted than version 1.0. Do not get me wrong, she could rock my world, but Becky version 2.0. This is a completely different experience." She laughed sultrily and knowingly and said, "I stopped fighting it. I love being a woman with all the advantages it gives me. The other one was just a stupid girl." She lacked the worldly experience to understand and appreciate the power that a woman has. For us, it was part of the new normal. I imagine others have had similar experiences. You close the door to one room and move into another, and when you do this, it seems as if the previous room never existed. It was the same with us. There was betrayal and tragedy in the abandoned room, but this happened to 2 other people in completely different lives. We have completely changed. We have a different, much more luxurious reality. Then my wife's mood turned serious. She said with a hint of nervousness in her voice, "I'm afraid this is the last glass of wine I'll drink in the near future. I hope you don't mind." I said, "Why should I object? You can drink whatever you want. But personally, I prefer wine." She said, continuing to speak carefully, "It could affect you too." Now I was puzzled and said, "How can your choice of drinks affect my life?" She said, "What if I say that I have to stop drinking because I'm pregnant?" It took a second. I admit I'm dumb. Then it dawned on me, and the roller coaster soared to new, completely unimaginable heights. It's one thing to share your life with the woman you love, it's quite another to raise children with her. Becky looked at me with barely suppressed glee. I stood up, grabbed her from the seat, and hugged her, speaking with such genuine feeling that I seemed to have never experienced. "I love you," and in the fullness of time, another door opened in my life. But that was in a different place, and that's another story. What do you think of our second half of the story? I think that the second part has more interesting moments that I want to listen and listen more, especially I like the end. What's your opinion? Write in the comments. Until new videos.